Welcome to Teal Talk, a podcast brought to you by the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. That's OAESV for short. We're your hosts, Taylor
and Lori.
In each episode, we speak with professionals in the field to dive deep into the intersectional issues that affect survivors in Ohio.
Before we begin, we want to give a content warning that we will be discussing sexual violence and other issues that may be upsetting and triggering. If you need help, please feel free to call our resource line at 888-886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. Please take care of yourself.
Hello, and welcome to our 7th episode of Teal Talk. My name is Lori Hamami. I'm the Communications and Content Coordinator. Taylor, can you believe it's already October?
I really can't. This year has flown by, and I think partly because we've all been so busy and been doing so many great projects and great things, and I'm really excited that also for this episode we get to hear a little bit more from our guests and what they've been doing this year. I'm Taylor. I'm the Chief Officer of Communications and Engagement at OAESV.
Yeah, so while April is our big month with Sam, just 6 months later, we get to learn all about domestic violence. And we're doing that today, and we're learning about the crossovers with 2 wonderful guests from the Ohio Domestic Violence Network.
So domestic violence and sexual violence are very connected, as are other forms of violence, because they're both rooted in oppression and the abuse of power, and because there is a lot of crossover. It's clear that violence perpetuates violence, and bringing awareness to these connections allows us to educate and to further prevent the cycles of both forms of assault. This is especially important this month because October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
It's my pleasure to introduce 2 guests today. First, we have Rachel Ramirez. She is the Director of Health and Disability Programs and the founder of the Center on Partner-Inflicted Brain Injury at the Ohio Domestic Violence Network, ODVN. Her focus is on supporting professionals and systems to better understand traumatic stress and the impacts of brain injury, which translates into more accessible and effective services. She provides extensive statewide, national, and international training, technical assistance, consultation, and program support. Rachel has co-authored several peer-reviewed journal articles and has been featured on National Public Radio, as well as in the New York Times Magazine and the Washington Post. Rachel is a licensed independent social worker and a registered advocate with senior standing and has been with ODVN for 16 years. Hi, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having us. I've been in Ohio for a long time and done lots of projects with OAESV over the years. I actually was at ODVN before there was an OAESV. So it's always wonderful to be able to continue to build our relationships and to be able to talk about all the ways in which our work intersects and connects. So thanks so much for having us.
Awesome. And next we have Kasey Holderbaum. She is the Health and Disability Project Coordinator with ODVN. She facilitates the COSTS Project, working with the Forensic Nursing Network and Brain Injury Association of Ohio to strengthen pathways and services and eliminate barriers for survivors of violence. Her background is in victim advocacy, shelter case management, and prevention education in Colorado and Texas. She is currently working to obtain a Master's of Public Administration from Ohio University, where she also earned a BA in psychology in 2013. Hello, Kasey.
Hi. Thanks for having us here. Really excited to talk about these intersections and the importance of domestic violence coming up for DVAM.
Okay, so with October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, I would love for you all to tell our audience a little bit more about some of the focus areas that you all are working on this October. And also, if you want to say a little bit more about your specific teams and projects that you're working on when it comes to disability and brain injury.
So October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we're excited to have this focus on this as a part of your podcast. We will be celebrating our annual Domestic Violence Awareness Month press day on October 11th at the State House. Of course, everybody is invited, and we would love to have you join us. One of the things that we will be doing is we will very much be celebrating our line item in the state budget. For those of you who might not have been aware, it wasn't until very recently that Ohio provided any kind of funding for domestic violence programs. It wasn't until about 4 years ago that there was any money at all for domestic violence programs in the Ohio budget, which left domestic violence programs heavily underfunded, heavily dependent on federal funding. So we're very excited about the funding that is able to support the 76 member programs across the state. Another thing that we will be doing at the State House is every year we release our annual fatality counts that really details the lives that have been lost to domestic violence every year in Ohio. I think for me, it's always talk so much about how the stakes couldn't be much higher, but really what can we learn about our fatalities? What can we understand? And how can we really help do that work that we need to do upstream to really prevent people from losing their lives to domestic violence? The other piece we will definitely be talking about, as many of you might know, that Ohio is the 50th and last state to have felony strangulation legislation, something that's very close to Kasey and my heart. And we'll be talking about it a little bit later about the connection between domestic violence, sexual violence, and brain injury. But we also will be highlighting that and providing the Croucher Family Violence Award to some leaders who have really made a difference in the domestic violence services this year. So we're very excited to be doing all of that.
Yeah, I think Rachel really covered kind of what we're preparing for October and Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Kasey, do you want to talk a little bit more about your role and the projects that you're working on?
As Lori mentioned, I facilitate what's called our COSTS collaboration, and that stands for the Collaboration on Strangulation and Traumatic Brain Injury Survivorship. So it is a collaboration between ODVN, the Forensic Nursing Network, and the Brain Injury Association of Ohio. So we received an OVW disabilities grant where we are working to really break down silos and strengthen services and pathways and resources for survivors who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and brain injury. So what's been really cool is I've been with ODVN for a little over a year now. And so I jumped in where our needs assessment was happening. And so got to really learn about the needs of this work in Ohio and the prevalence of strangulation and sexual violence in domestic violence services. And so coming together to really bring attention to domestic violence in the sexual violence space, the brain injury space, bringing brain injury into the sexual violence, domestic violence space, and then same with sexual violence into brain injury and DV. So we've worked on creating new resources, we've worked on creating new policies, and really just bringing a disability and brain injury lens to the resources and the programs that we're working with.
Thank you so much. We know that a lot of that collaboration is really needed and that these are areas of the work that many people don't know about. So I did want to give the opportunity for you, Rachel, if you wanted to add anything. I know that looking at the impact of brain injury is very much your area of expertise. So if you have anything you want to add, please.
7 years ago, if you had asked me what brain injury had to do with domestic violence, I would have said, I don't know. Maybe I'll give a little bit of a backstory to how the work of Kasey came to be. Was that ODVN was awarded a grant in 2016 to look at how do we make domestic violence programs more accessible to survivors who have disabilities. And we picked a couple of focus areas for very, very different reasons. We picked a focus area related to mental health because I'm sure people who work in sexual violence also know trying to really effectively meet the needs in a trauma-informed way of survivors who are struggling with lots of other issues, including mental health, can be very challenging. We know that domestic violence, sexual violence, any type of violence has a significant impact on people's overall health and mental health and well-being. There are certain areas of work that we do that we will always be able to grow in, that we will always be able to learn more, that I don't know if we'll ever kind of master, if that makes sense, not in a good or bad way, but just due to the complexities of the survivors that we're working with, we are always going to need to be open to new ideas and new ways and how we're working with survivors on an individual basis, because people just need different things. So we knew mental health was difficult and hard, and we always want to do a better job on that. But then the brain injury piece was kind of the opposite. It was something that we didn't know much about. It was something that even with all of the years that we had providing training and program support, we had never talked about it at our organization. It wasn't a part of any of our training. We didn't have relationships in those fields. And it was something that when you hear about it, I think a lot of people are kind of like, that seems kind of obvious to a certain extent. Like, nobody's shocked that domestic violence victims are assaulted in the head, neck, or face, or strangled. That's not the new information. The new information is like, wow, it could lead to brain injury, which could continue to impact survivors for, days, months, weeks, years, for years and years and years, with very little awareness of what that was. So when we talk to survivors at our programs, over 80% had pretty extensive head trauma. But we asked, what do you know about brain injury? It was kind of like us, like pretty much like not a lot, next to nothing. And even survivors themselves haven't ever really connected how their head trauma could cause a brain injury and kind of what that is. So we partnered closely with agencies and developed a framework called CARE, which is an acronym for connecting, acknowledging, responding, and evaluating. We have a bunch more information about that on our website. But one of the things that was really interesting, and one of the reasons why I'm so excited you invited us to join this podcast, is when we were talking to our domestic violence programs that we were working with, we were asking them, who else needs this information? Who else needs to know about that? They said people who do sexual violence work. And I actually remember an advocate, sharing a story about a sexual violence survivor who was in a support group and was very frustrated, kind of felt like she should be doing better than she was, that some time had passed. She just kind of felt like, it's been this long, I'm still having these problems. What am I doing wrong? What should I be doing differently? And, something that we learned from our dual programs, of which we have many in Ohio, really showing how that sexual violence and domestic violence aren't separate things. Dual programs, we're talking about brain injury with sexual violence survivors. And a lot of times it's not that people forgot they were hurt in the head, but when you think about all that can happen in the context of a sexual assault and what you're thinking about, that's an easy piece to kind of get missed. And, she was feeling kind of, again, like fuzzy, and I can't focus and I can't think, and I'm having a hard time at my job, and being able to have a context for that and just kind of realizing that, I was hurt in the head as a part of my assault. This could be one of the reasons. And it's not because I don't want it enough. It's not because I'm stupid. It's not because I'm not putting enough effort into this. It's because my brain was hurt. I always say, like, when our brains are hurt, it doesn't do things as well, or what our brains are made to help us think and process and manage our emotions and do all of those things. So just like when you twist your ankle, you don't walk as well. Like, when our brains are hurt, we can't do some of those things as well. So I think that that's one of the things that we realized was how important this collaboration with other fields was. Even though we don't totally have everything figured out, we all have opportunities to help kind of put some of this framework on the table. And what we really learned is survivors find this information very almost relieving. That, again, it's not me. And I think that's one of the other big, huge connections between domestic violence and sexual violence that focus on providing trauma-informed services. But it's bringing that brain injury awareness to trauma-informed services and being able to say, like, A, I can't want this more and try harder. And B, this is because somebody hurt me. It's not because something's wrong with me. And we think, trauma-informed care is all. It's not what's wrong with you. It's what happened to you. After this initial project, we were like, we have to do this with other systems and with other organizations because it touches so many people's lives. Another piece we're really excited too about learning from the sexual violence field is, you all have done a lot more work in healthcare. We need to be doing healthcare, and we need to be thinking about that and working with that and learning from all the amazing work that you all have done.
That was a lot of really insightful information.
I can ramble, sorry.
I love a good rambler. When you even think of the phrase or the word or the crime, sexual violence, the name itself, it's pretty straightforward. Sexual violence, violence of a sexual nature. Mm-hmm. And it almost, not intentionally, but omits this whole portion of other kinds of violence that can be experienced while you're experiencing sexual violence. So I can very much understand how a sexual violence survivor would be like, wait, I had a head trauma I didn't even realize.
I mean, there's obviously a lot going on when somebody is sexually assaulted. It was interesting that I was talking to a forensic nurse when we think about forensic exams for sexual assault. And you know how you kind of have to have a little bit of a sense of humor when you do this work, but a lot of the focus has been on the waist and below. And I would say probably in domestic violence, our focus has been on the waist and above. But I wouldn't say in domestic violence, us talking about the sexual coercion, about some of the sexual violence that can be a part of that domestic violence. I think that in the domestic violence field, we're a little bit less comfortable about that. I mean, again, we know it's there, but there's all of these other things that are kind of bigger and we have more practice talking about. And, those of us who do the domestic violence work are like, are we prying? I think that that's something else that can kind of be not an intentional afterthought, but there's so many other things going on, it's easy for that piece to get lost.
Yeah, one thing that came to mind as you were talking, Rachel, is like increasing that comfort to talk about it. Before any of us got into the field of advocacy or into domestic violence or sexual violence work, we didn't have that language to talk about it. It's only after learning and experience that we really become comfortable and knowledgeable about those things. So frequently we talk about the silos in the work that we do. So, as an advocate, if you hear sexual violence, sexual assault, brain injury, strangulation, what is that comfort level for an advocate to be able to respond to that? It can become very overwhelming to not only ask those questions or perhaps have those conversations, but also not knowing what the answer will be and not knowing if we're equipped to respond. That was something that came to mind when you were talking, Rachel, about how just enhancing the skills and capacity of providers to understand how these are connected can really benefit survivors and their access to services.
We're working with a whole person, and I don't think that we're doing anybody any favors when we divide certain types of abuse and coercion, or whether we're looking at certain parts of the bodies. We're all of us, and I think that we have so much to teach each other, but also so much to learn from each other. I do think that we know that there's a lot of hesitancy to talk about things we're not comfortable talking about. You all know this more than anything, kind of some of those myths around what sexual violence is and what it looks like. And a lot of times in domestic violence, if we were to say, have you been raped? Have you experienced sexual violence? Many people would say no. I mean, most of us, if you were to sit next to the bus and start to talk to someone about any type of sex you've ever had, like this, it's not something that we talk about. And often what we're asking survivors to do is to trust us with very, very, very intimate details of their lives, of which we'd never share with anybody. People might not be open and forthcoming for a lot of really good reasons. And really recognizing that we need to earn survivors' trusts and be open to what they say. And that all starts in building those connections with survivors, which is the first component of care, is really connecting effectively and really thinking about what does relationship building look like with people who have experienced trauma and betrayal, which is what sexual violence and domestic violence is.
Thank you. You were referencing how sexual violence, it can be hidden, but it's so common and a complex aspect of domestic violence. And the sexual violence piece can become normalized within the context of an abusive relationship. But can you tell us what are some additional challenges maybe you've seen faced by survivors that are experiencing both SV and DV?
I think that there are a lot of survivors who experience sexual violence and domestic violence and wouldn't call it either of those things. Domestic violence isn't always like the Lifetime movies about domestic violence. This like super scary, really, really awful, chasing you around all the time. Like that's not what domestic violence looks like. And we know from sexual violence, most sexual violence isn't the person hidden behind the bushes that breaks into your house in the middle of the night and does these terrible, awful things to you. I don't know how important it is, whether a survivor calls it sexual violence. I feel like that's not my job to convince them what it is or what it's not. But, if I have an organization like the Ohio Domestic Violence Network and I don't identify what's happening to me as domestic violence, of course I'm not going to reach out to you. You know what I mean? So, I think that there's a huge difference between any type of violence, if you're experiencing violence with a person that Or particularly, I think in domestic violence, a lot of times one of the additional complexities that we have was that people whose finances might be very commingled, people who have children together, people who have family and friends together, people who have lives together. And the $64 million question or whatever is, how do we hold people who use violence accountable without that also negatively impacting the lives of the survivors? If I am assaulted and somebody goes to jail and loses their job and their life doesn't directly impact mine, I'm not going to care much. If that person is my partner and I get all of the implication, and it's, again, I have family with them, that I could be all of the finances, all of the kids, all of that stuff, that just has a very different impact. And I think that that's, another thing that can be very, very different is the kind of the depth and breadth of that relationship and kind of all of the ways in which lives are intermingled and very, very difficult to figure out, how do I kind of safely separate this without it really screwing up my life as a survivor of abuse.
That's a really amazing point. Yeah, that's extremely complicated. And so many people look at both domestic violence and sexual violence in that kind of like black and white way of, that's just a bad person. You just need to cut all ties. You just need to get away from them. And it's much more complicated than that in most situations.
Yeah, I always say I wouldn't have to have this job if all people who use sexual violence were these like terrible, horrible, awful people all the time, and that they walked around intimidating people and scary and yelling and doing all of those coercive things. Like, people aren't like that. People don't fall in love with people or develop those deep ties with people when they're abusive. That's just not part of that process. And I think that that's something that can, again, make it very, very difficult. I think one of the things that I've also been thinking about when we talk about, sexual violence and sexual coercion and what that all looks like, and even, talking about strangulation, something that we've also heard is how we see some normalization of violent sex, particularly, on the internet, in social media, in movies, and kind of mainstream shows. I know as the mother of an almost 16-year-old, just even the whole contact, how normal it is. We were going somewhere the other day. She was like, oh, pulled out her phone. Let me check and see who else is going to be here, because they all know where they are all the time. I do think that the whole, like, what does healthy sex and what does consent look like and where are those lines? I think that's just a whole different conversation that we are having now, just because of access to information and social media and all that. I mean, I think even talking about strangulation and strangulation being kind of this sexy thing that sexy people do, and, kind of what that is and what that looked like, and not really having an understanding behind that. How many text messages is too many messages, and how many snaps is too many snaps? Like, it's just so different. I personally am very, very glad I was not a teenager at this time. And there's a lot of things that I'm glad probably all of us on this are like, I am sure glad that we didn't record everything that we did when we were 12 through 16. And that's all gone and nobody has anything. But it's just, I think it's a very, very different world that is unlike anytime many of us have ever experienced, and really kind of knowing, like, what even does that coercion mean and look like, and where are some of those lines?
So when you mention that most people on the street day to day are thinking about domestic violence and thinking that means someone that you're in a relationship with, conversely, when people think sexual violence, like you mentioned, they think of a person hiding behind a dumpster or in a parking garage. And we've discussed the crossover between DV and SV in a sense that SV is a common and complex part of DV in a lot of cases. But I think something that makes them different is that, yes, sexual violence most often does occur by someone you know. It also can be that scary person in the parking garage, where domestic violence, definitionally isn't. So I think that perfectly segues me into our last question. At OAESV, we believe the root causes of sexual violence are oppression and the misuse of power. So how do you see this come up in domestic violence?
Well, that is the crux of what domestic violence is. It is based on power and control, and it wouldn't exist if somebody wasn't trying to get power and control over somebody else or trying to have that ownership or anything like that.
When we look at the roots of domestic violence, it's really thinking about how do we learn about what relationships are supposed to be, what they're supposed to look like, what am I entitled to in certain roles, what should sex look like, what is on the table, what is off the table. And I think that those all come from very, very deeply rooted long messages of us being a society where for many hundreds of years, and we could even argue now, like certain groups of people were supposed to have power and other groups of people weren't. And that was the natural way that you can break those groups based along biological sex, based along race, based along socioeconomic status, based along religion, ability and disability. There's so many different ways. One group is supposed to be in charge and the other group isn't. And I know that we've seen, some incredible changes in the past couple of decades, and even, talking about kind of where does it come from, where it's kind of like okay and permitted and kind of supposed to be that way, that me as a member of this group, which often, again, we don't choose, we're all born different races, different biological sex, and different, family circumstances in different countries. But there's certain privileges or rights or advantages that I should have, and it's supposed to be that way. I remember the opportunities I've had to talk with people who work with abusers and work with people who use violence, and how one of the reasons why it's so hard for that stuff to be changed is it's an entitlement and a right. And it's a framework of thinking and thinking that there are certain things that I'm owed, and how many, domestic violence people who use violence say things like, well, it wasn't my fault. I did that because the victim broke a rule. And if they had just followed a rule, but like, where does that whole idea that rules, like, where does that come from? And again, we are in a country where for several hundred years, it was legal to own other people, and it was legal to sell other people's children. And it was, you know what I mean? Like, that's the history that we come from. And women in this country have only been voting for 100 years. So that whole idea of one group should have power over another, and that's just the way it's supposed to be, I think is something that we see replicating itself on an individual level, and also what we're trying to shift. And it really is kind of that larger issue of this hierarchy, and this group was up here and this group was down here, and that's how it's supposed to be.
Yeah, that definitely was not meant to be a trick question. Of course, there's an overlap there, because in all those scenarios that you just described, it's like, yeah, that's also how sexual violence thrives. We use language like I was putting someone in their place, or, well, they deserved it, I have power over them, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like because of this, understanding this overlap can better help us to prevent both forms of violence. Because if we're saying that violence perpetuates violence, and that both DV and SV are interconnected, I feel by working to prevent one, we can also be preventing the other. And it's just helpful to recognize these connections and consider the survivor in the context of all the environments that they could be in, the larger community, their family structures, their neighborhoods. So this has been a really insightful conversation. You've brought up a lot of points that I really hadn't considered, and also solidified a lot of points that I knew were true.
That's always the sign of a good conversation, when you're like, oh, I hadn't thought about it, but like, whew, I was right about that.
Yes. Cross collaboration is important.
Any opportunity that we have for domestic violence advocates to really think about sexual violence and sexual coercion as a part of our work. And how are we becoming, as Kasey said, more comfortable in addressing that, more comfortable building those relationships and those connections. I think for sexual violence survivors, also thinking about how does that relationship change things. If it's somebody that I know and have all of these relationships with and all these connections with, that could really, really change things. So Ellen Pence always said, we all have something to learn and we all have something to teach in every interaction that we have. And that is with each other on this podcast. That is when we're working with survivors. That is when we're advocating and working with other professionals. But we all have to just make sure that we're open to teaching and open to learning and hearing other people's experiences.
Definitely. And I love that you've reiterated that point about the difference between a stranger versus someone in your life. The impact would be different. And also how it's viewed is so different, like the stigma there. If it's a stranger on the street, people are probably going to feel a lot worse for you or feel a much different way than, but you have kids and think about this and think about the family.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
Almost becomes like easier to talk about because it's less taboo, right? It's easily a crime. Somebody harmed me. There's an easy process for that, not all the complications of life.
Definitely. It's been so wonderful to chat with you both today. And I'd love if we could wrap up by sharing how folks can get involved this October.
We will have a calendar on our website of local domestic violence events. Many of our 76 member programs cover all 88 counties in Ohio. Many of them have local events that they are doing, from trainings to ceremonies to walks to lunches. There's lots of different events. So you can go to our website to check that out to see kind of what might be close to you in your area of Ohio. Last year, the national theme for Domestic Violence Awareness Month was Everyone Knows Someone. And I think that that's just another piece. A lot of people think, domestic violence is something. Same thing I think with sexual violence. It's something that happens over there with these type of people or in these neighborhoods. Or you have somebody in your life that has been touched by domestic and sexual violence. The vast majority of people disclose and discuss and share about that with people that they know and people that they trust. You being able to remember to be somebody who is aware and supportive. One of the things that's most important is making sure you provide unconditional support to them. It is very, very hard to escape an abusive relationship. And being non-judgmental, making sure you're listening to people, making sure that you're sending messages like people deserve to be safe in their relationship and that it's not anybody's fault because they're doing this. It's very, very hard to leave a relationship. To escape a relationship is what I often like to call abusive relationships. Often increases danger. Really having people that are there, knowing about who your local domestic violence agency is or sexual violence agency is, and learning more about that. Everybody listening to this has an enormous role to play in supporting survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence because they're not totally separate things.
I just want to piggyback off of that. One thing that I've learned from Rachel in starting work with her a little over a year ago is that we can't all do everything, but everyone can do something. So this Domestic Violence Month, we can all do something. We all have our role to play in this, whether it's talking about it, educating people, sharing resources and connections, or listening to this podcast.
I very much agree with that, especially wrapping back around with technology comments we made earlier and how many movies and books and shows all cover abusive relationships, and maybe not always in the most accurate way. I think it's important to also be able to tell the truth behind how this actually shows up. It's not always the exploitative way that Hollywood shows it, right? It's most often not.
And that's what makes it so hard to identify.
Yeah.
Because people are like, mine doesn't look like this. Well, maybe it was me. Maybe I did do something. Maybe if I had done something differently, But yeah, I think that everybody can do something.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Teal Talk. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into intersectional issues affecting survivors in Ohio. If you like what you heard, subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating and review, recommend us to a friend, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at OAESV and Twitter at Ohio Alliance ESV. If you'd like to learn more about us and the services we offer, sign up for our email list, or read a transcript of this episode, visit oaesv.org.
Want to share a comment or ask a question for a future episode? Just click on the link in the show notes to leave us a voicemail. And remember, we're here to help. Feel free to call our resource line at 886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. See you next time.